Interdisciplinary Studies at OP Jindal Global University. My name is George Shikhar Singh. I'm currently a PhD scholar at Jindal School of International Affairs, and I have the privilege of moderating today's discussion. We are very much delighted to have Dr. Chisom Ubabukoh, a senior research fellow at IDEAS and associate professor at Jindal Global Law School. He has a strong academic foundation when it comes to developmental economics, and having a doctoral from the University of Manchester. Dr. Chisom brings both scholarly and practical experience to our discussion today, ranging from his years of teaching in the UK to his impactful work, which includes the Nigerian Federal Ministry of Agriculture, IFPRI, and the Development Bank. So thank you very much, Dr. Chisom, for joining for today's session. For joining us as the discussant is Dr. Abhishek Shur, research fellow at IDEAS and associate professor at Jindal Global Law School. Dr. Sur's research on international capital flows and macroeconomic policy in emerging markets, particularly in the Indian context, it's very complementary for what today shall be the discussion of our event, right? His doctoral work at IIM Ranchi explored the complexities of external commercial borrowings in India, providing both macroeconomic and firm level insights. In addition to having published in reputed journals, Dr. Sur brings years of experience in the Indian banking sector, which informs his understanding of financial and policy dynamics when it comes to developing economics. Thank you very much, Professor Abhishek, for joining in as a discussant, and we are very glad to have you. So, coming to today's presentation and talk primarily focuses on Professor Chisom's ongoing working paper titled Exploring Economic and Institutional Determinants of India and Africa Trade Relations. The context could not be more timely, as India, a state which continues to enhance its economic context, is sort of going into this more deep-rooted strategic footprints when it comes to Africa. Understand, and which leads us to think about the fact that we need to understand these structural and institutional variables that shape trade between the two regions. That understanding, that idea of how that trade is going to go ahead, is very crucial for our understanding on a larger economic analysis. With the rise of bilateralism and regional cooperation frameworks, studies like Professor Chisom's, they sort of help uncover how governance, regulatory structure sort of influence economic exchange, sometimes in surprising ways. And well, completely understanding the fact that how trade continues to be a very evolving dynamics, both economically and politically, the very rationale and the importance of the topic could not be further underlined. The format for today's session will be very straightforward. We shall begin with Professor Chisom's presentation of the paper, after which Professor Abhishek will offer his commentary and critical reflections on the same. Once both have spoken, we will open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. Please feel free to note down your questions and either raise your hand or post them in the chat during the Q&A session, which will be going towards the end. Without further ado, and once again acknowledging the gratitude that we have for both of you being present for today's session, I now invite Dr. Chisom to present his paper analysis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jude. And thanks to the IDEAS team for putting this together. So basically, this is just going to be kind of like just a discussion. I just want to get ideas from others regarding a few details in the paper, and then I shouldn't take too long, hopefully. Okay, so I'll just share my screen to share the slides. And then I don't know, is it visible?
Yeah, it's visible. It's clearly visible.
Okay, great. So here I'm exploring the economic and institutional determinants of India-Africa trade relations. This is the topic. This is going to be the outline of how the presentation would go. I will just give a little bit of an introduction, a background. Then I will discuss the gravity model of trade. Then I will discuss the literature on institutional variables, the modeling strategy, some data, and then the results. So starting with the introduction, India is the 5th largest economy in the world. It's a tremendous economy, nominal GDP of over $3.7 trillion. It's huge. And not only is it a big economy, it's also growing very fast. It's projected to be one of the top 3 countries in the world by 2027, if it continues at the current growth rate of over 7%. And this is really huge. And India has been expanding its footprint around the world, especially in the developing world. Africa, even though it's made up of over 50 countries, sometimes it makes sense to study as a block for many reasons. 6 of the 10 fastest growing countries in the world, they are African countries. All the countries together have a combined GDP of just over $3.5 trillion, which is quite similar to the GDP of India put together. Also, Africa has a very young, growing population, similar also to India. So Africa and India are very similar in many ways. They have many similarities. So in terms of the strategic partnership between them, both of these blocks have huge consumer markets. Africa has a population of altogether around 1.4 billion, similar to India as well. We have complementary strengths, while India has great strengths in manufacturing and in some kind of value addition. The comparative advantage Africa has in production, basically, of natural resources and raw materials. And this partnership tends to work well. There's also been a greater emphasis in recent times on South-South cooperation. India's chairmanship of the G20 was a very big moment because they facilitated and advocated for the inclusion of Africa to be a full member of that body, and they were successful in doing that. So, very, very huge moment for Africa. Food and energy security and digital and tech collaboration has also been expanding a lot in recent years. So these are just some ways that these 2 regions have collaborated. Also, just in terms of a historical perspective, there's been a lot of relationship between India and Africa for a very long time. By the 1st century, Indian merchants were already moving into the continent, going over the Indian Ocean to the East Africa region, trading for spices, ivory, gold, etc. And from the 17th century onwards, Indian communities have migrated into Africa. And there was also migration the other way around. I think we also have a significant community of African origin Indians, some people call the Sidis. There's been a large, cross-matching of civilizations there. Present-day partnership trade between India and Africa has grown from around $8.2 billion in the year 2000 to over $100 billion in 2023. And that's a huge leap for something to happen just within about 20 years or thereabout. A tremendous amount of growth. And we'll discuss this more as we go on. The Africa bloc is India's 3rd largest trading partner after the US and the EU. So it's a very significant trading partner with India. However, despite this very important trade relationship, there are not that many studies that have been done specifically on this issue, trying to characterize the economic relationship between India and Africa as a bloc. There's been a lot of discussions in bit parts, but nothing really comprehensive using a traditional economic model to study this. And that is what makes this paper a little bit unique. I do have to mention that even though trade with India has grown to over $100 billion by 2023, which is huge, by the way, trade between India and the US is just over 100, is over 120 billion as well. So very comparable. It's not that different. You know, in terms of the strength of the relationship is huge. But I do have to mention that China, in the same period by 2023, has a trade relationship with Africa worth over 283 billion. So this is almost more than almost 3 times as much. So there is a huge gap. What that simply says is that there's a lot more potential for expansion and for increase in terms of this relationship. So I'll just quickly discuss the gravity model of trade next. So to understand what factors are important in trade, economists borrowed an idea from Newton's law of gravity. And of course, I'm just going to keep it really simple. I'm not going into any of the technical aspects of this. But the point is, Newton's law of gravity stated that every object has a gravitational pull to every other object. And the only thing that creates that, talks about the strength of that attraction, that gravitational attraction, is the mass of the object, how large it is, and then the distance between them. So if you have like a very large object like the Earth, the Earth is a huge amount of mass. The Earth, has a very tremendous amount of attraction to everything that is on the Earth. And so, all those little bodies, human beings and everything else that is on the Earth is attracted by the force of gravity just because of the size of the Earth. And some trade economists borrowed from this idea. Ravenstein, 1885, Tinbergen, 1962, Anderson. These were the first ones who really studied this thing from this perspective. They applied the idea to trade in the sense that now they can say a country that is very big, measured by GDP, and those that are closer together in terms of geography, they will tend to have more trade or more kind of trading relationship than countries that are smaller economies and countries that are farther apart geographically. And so this laid the foundation. They were able to use this as a theoretical base to kind of build the model. So the core form of the model is we have trade on, as the dependent variable. And then you have the GDP of the two trading countries, and then the distance between them. The expectation is that the beta 2, let me see if I have my pointer here. The expectation is that the beta 2 will be negative because if the distance is smaller, you tend to have more trade, and if the distance is greater, you tend to have less trade. And this one should be positive. So I will also discuss institutional variables. Now, institutional quality is an extension of the basic gravity model. Some people have come up with the idea that it makes sense to also include institutional variables in addition to the standard basic gravity model variables. And so people like Dollar and Cray, 2003, Anderson and Marcolia, they started including some institutional variables like government effectiveness, regulatory quality. Those are some of the common institutional variables included to try to explain how much trade is happening between countries. Remember, the model is just trying to explain what determines the level of trade. So in addition to the size of the economies in GDP and the distance, and then some other small control variables, we are also including how effective the government is, and then the regulatory quality of those governments in terms of explaining the level of trade between the countries. So the theory is that you need a more effective government and you need more regulatory quality to foster international trade by reducing transaction costs and by enhancing policy predictability, ensuring the fairness of contracts. If you have a contract and there's a breach, the strong legal system of the institution will create justice. And the more of that you have, the more trade you can have, is the theory. But also regarding corruption, there are two main, kind of ideas here. The first one is the more predominant one, called sanding the wheels hypothesis. And this one just simply says that corruption is always bad. Wherever you see corruption, it is evil. And it always imposes a significant financial and institutional, problem to any economy that has it, right? So, and it says that if you have, the more corruption you have, the less your economy will flow, will move, because it's always an impediment, a hindrance to the movement of the economy. And a lot of papers have written on this significantly. But there's also another strand in the literature called the greasing the wheels effect. Some other people will call it the efficient corruption hypothesis. And it's a little bit of a strange one. When I was reading this, it was a little bit strange because I felt, okay, no author should be advocating for corruption. But they found that the data gives a different story. So it's not really about an idea that somebody just has. The data is saying something. And for many of these papers, for example, Lev, Friedrich, Asimoglu, and Redier, they were able to show that where there are large administrative delays, so your administration, you make an application for something and it takes a long time, the bureaucracy just keeps grinding on, and you don't get what you're supposed to get within the time frame that you're expecting to get it. Where there are procedural rigidities, it's so rigid in terms of the procedure, the bureaucracy. The theory is that corruption could actually help to grease the wheels of commerce, because when there's some corruption, this is not about what is right and wrong in terms of what you deserve to get, but this is talking about even if you are right, it moves very slowly, and that could be a hindrance to making progress in terms of your trading relationship. And this theory says corruption could actually grease the wheels of industry and trade. But the caveat is that this is always a temporary thing. I should also mention that every study that has kind of given legs to the greasing the wheels hypothesis have always been done in the developing country context. And for developed nations, the sanding the wheels approach tends to be the more predominant idea. But this is, something to take note of as we, see the results of this analysis. And I just want to briefly talk about the PPML estimator that we are using to estimate the gravity model. The coefficients in the gravity model, as explained earlier, can be estimated using different methods. As I said, I'm not going into the technicalities of it because that is not that important for this, this conversation. We could use simple OLS, or we could use some fixed effects, or something called a gamma PML. This paper uses the PPML method, or the Poisson pseudo maximum likelihood method, and it has been recognized as the most robust in dealing with trade information for many reasons. Number one is that when you have trade data, very often you have zeros where there is zero trade. Either data was not recorded or there was no trade happening for that time period. And anytime you have a zero trade number and you take the log of that, remember the base formulation of the gravity model has log of trade. When you take the log of zero, it is undefined. And if you have many of those kind of things, it will bias the results completely. And so what the PPML does is that it allows us to do the analysis without taking the logs of trade and just taking the trade in levels. And then if we take the trade in levels, this will allow us to have a more unbiased kind of estimate of the coefficients. That is one thing. Another thing is PPML, implicitly already assumes heteroscedasticity, which is also recognized as a big problem of trade models. The PPML assumes or presumes that the variability is not the same all across the distribution, which is what homoscedasticity is all about, where you say the error from the mean is the same all along the distribution. This model assumes this is not the case. It allows you to have, heteroscedastic observations. It also gives more weight to large trade flows, and those things matter more in terms of characterizing trade. And even when the Poisson model is not perfect, remember a Poisson model is a count model, so very different from like a normal distribution where you have a continuous whatever. The Poisson model is count based, so it tries to predict the possibility of trade based on certain variables. That's why it's called a Poisson-Soulier method. Okay. So this is the reduced form model that I'm working with. I have trade on the y-axis. I have this exponent term is one correction that the PPML does. And we have our constant. We have this term here is distance. So distance between the capital of India, Delhi, and the capital of the African nation. And here we have the GDP of India. Here we have GDP of the African country over time. Here we have the population of the African nation. Here we have corruption. Here we have government efficiency or government effectiveness. Here we have regulatory quality, the quality of the regulations. Just as I explained, I will explain each of these variables in the next couple of slides. So data, the data on GDP and population were obtained from the WDI database. The data on distance, common language, common colonizer, these are also very common controls that are used in the gravity model. We have also included this as well. These data were gotten from CEPII database also, which kind of collates all this information for all the country pairs. So remember, we are looking at country pairs between India and the African nations. The control of corruption variable represents how much public authority is exploited for personal benefit. It combines both small and big corruption. And, in essence, this variable has been standardized, to between minus 2.5 and 2.5 standard deviations. So it's standardized in the sense that the global mean is 0 and the standard deviation is 1. So just like a normal distribution, it's been standardized. It was gotten from the WGI, World Government or Governance Indicators. I should say, the way the control of corruption variable was calculated, I had to study that because it's very important to my analysis. They took both surveys of people, citizens, and they also had expert analysis of the different countries. And all this information was collated using a latent variable model, trying to explain the underlying corruption, but using those variables as an explanatory kind of tool. And eventually it was standardized. What these deviations mean, like between minus 2.5 and minus 2 and minus 1, as I said, if you're moving from 0, if you're at 0, you are kind of like at the average, global average of control of corruption. If you're moving from 0 to 1, then you are moving into the 84th percentile. So basically, you're doing better than around 84% of countries in the world if you're moving from 0 to 1. So you are now at the top end. Moving from 0 to 1 makes your country a very huge, less corrupt country in terms of the strength of control of corruption. So if you let me see if I can just make a little small picture here. So it's kind of like a normal distribution where the middle is 0 and you have, standard deviations to the right and standard deviations to the left. So if you are moving from 0 to 1, you're moving into the 85th percentile in terms of control of corruption. If you're moving even more to 2 standard deviations away from the mean, that means you are like in the top 2% of countries. So out of 100 countries, there might be only 2 countries that are having a score above 2 standard deviations from the mean. So kind of the idea is that most countries will lie in the region between -1 and 1. So it's moving 1 standard deviation in this method is a huge deal. That is the point I'm just trying to make. And it's the same with the other variables, government effectiveness and regulatory quality. They are also standard deviation variables. Government effectiveness measures the perceived standards of public service, caliber of the civil service, how effective the civil service are, alongside the autonomy from political influence. This is also in government effectiveness. And then under regulatory quality, it's really measuring how well the African governments can create and enforce effective policies and regulations conducive to foster the private sector growth. And both of these things were also obtained from the World Governance Indicators as well. Okay. So this is just basic information on how merchandise trade between India and Africa has operated over the years from around 1998 onwards. You can see this is very low. At this stage, it was around $8 billion of trade, or even less, $5 billion of trade, really minuscule. But there was a huge increase from the early 2000s, into 2010, etc. There was a huge increase in the level of trade between India and Africa. By the way, this measurement here on the left is in millions of dollars. So this is around 6 billion, 8 billion, 10 billion, 12 billion. So in terms of volumes, it has increased very rapidly. One reason why trade increased a lot in this period, I think, has a lot to do with India's policy on liberalization, on deregulation that happened around this time. A lot of trade reforms from 1991. India had begun to implement a lot of these trade reforms. Also, increasing oil needs. They needed a lot of oil to drive the industrialization of the country. So increasing the oil needs, a lot of the oil that they eventually got has come from Africa. And just generally increased trade ties. You know about the India-Africa Forum Summit from 2008 that has been there. Those are some of the things that have, kind of fueled the great increase. And then there was a kind of drop. This drop here is most likely a result of the financial crisis that has happened 07, 08. And then there was a recovery as well again. And then there was another drop around 2013, 2014, thereabouts. And this one most likely is as a result of India's policy on the change in the currency. What was it called? Yeah, I can't recall. There was a particular policy that India had where they recorded a huge amount of currency, trying to stop people from holding currency illegally and all kinds of black market transactions. They wanted to bring this thing into the mainstream. And that's created demonetization. Yes, correct. Yes, thank you. Demonetization policy, where they were trying to bring all these things into the mainstream. And due to the demonetization, many businesses that would otherwise have been undergoing trade, there was a huge issue there. And that crisis lasted for a couple of years, but then once again, huge recovery happened after. And then very shortly, the COVID pandemic also caused a very deep kind of fall in the trade relationship. But then recent data has shown that it has once again recovered. So every time that there has been some issue that has caused a fall in the relationship between India-Africa trade, there has always been a remarkable recovery, and the COVID pandemic is no different. Currently, the merchandise trade is currently around $90 billion, which is massive. My prediction is that, or my kind of projection is that by 2027, the trade should surpass $100 billion if it continues on the current trajectory. Right now, the total trade between India and Africa is already over $100 billion. but this is including services, and services is a big part of the trade. Like you have telecom services, Airtel is really big in many African countries. A lot of these kind of service-based companies. But this data is only on merchandise, which is physical goods and services, which is actually crossing the borders, because that's how the direction of trade statistics is calculated. So this is on merchandise trade. The prediction is that by 2027, merchandise trade will be over 100 billion, which is really massive. But the point is there something that can be done to increase the trade volumes even more? Remember I said, China is having something that is completely off the chart. If I was to put the China graph here, it would never appear on this graph because it's just way above, these numbers. Here is the same information, but now I have divided into imports and exports. The dark blue region is Africa's exports to India or into India, and the kind of lighter blue area is Africa's imports from India. And the trade balance looks like it's more in favor of Africa because there are more Africa's exports to India than Africa's imports from India. However, this difference is made up in a large chunk by simply just oil exports. And if you take oil exports away, then the story reverses. If you take oil exports away from this, then Africa's imports from India becomes a lot more than Africa's exports to India. And here I just have the top 10 trading partners, once again disaggregated into exports and imports. So the dark blue one is exports to India, and the light blue area is imports from India. And once again, like for example, Nigeria has a huge dark blue component, huge exports to India. Once again, this is oil. Angola also is a big oil exporter. South Africa has a more, kind of accurate picture of what actually these things would look like if oil was not involved. There's more imports from India. I will talk about some of the goods and products that are often traded between the two regions. So India mostly imports mostly natural resources like crude oil from West African markets like Nigeria and Angola. Others are agricultural products like cocoa beans, cashew nuts, and some natural resources like coal, gold, and platinum from Central and Middle Africa, also diamonds from South Africa. Minerals like iron ore, gypsum, zinc are also imported from many countries. And then on the reverse side, the exports of India to Africa are mostly manufactured goods, So, for example, automobiles goes to all regions, pharmaceuticals goes to all regions. I think in Africa there's a lot of vehicles from Tata Company, especially in Kenya, is really big over there. Mahindra pickups, Mahindra trucks are also big in Southern Africa. Scorpio SUVs are also big in some parts of Southern Africa because these places have kind of like the savanna region. So for some of those savanna trips where people go on to see the wildlife, they use some of these trucks and vehicles. Bajaj Autos, which makes like those tuk-tuks or three-wheeled vehicles, tricycles. They are also very big in Nigeria, Ghana, some of those countries. So Bata shoes also. There are so many examples of kind of the things that Africa imports from India. Apollo tires is really big in many areas, many countries. And pharmaceuticals, of course, everything pharmaceuticals. Cipla company exports a lot of drugs to Africa. During the COVID pandemic, a lot of the vaccines that were used not only in Africa but around the world. I mean, India has become a pharmaceutical powerhouse. So this has happened. Also, refined petroleum has also been exported. Textiles, machinery, and chemicals have been exported to the north-southern parts of Africa as well. Well, I mean, also there's a story to be told in terms of the type of goods that are traded, where Africa is trading mostly raw materials and basic goods. India is, on the other hand, trading manufactured goods and pharmaceuticals. I will say that this really has to do a lot with where these regions have comparative advantages. And even though some people have said that why shouldn't you encourage the African countries to produce their own things? My view is that this is happening more and more. More Indian companies are actually establishing manufacturing bases in Africa, even though there should be a lot more of it happening. But still, Africa is having tremendous benefits as well from these manufactured goods coming, especially from India. The Western countries, when they export manufactured goods, they tend to be too expensive for the local people. And having cheap, good quality manufactured goods coming in, it's a stopgap. It helps the people to be able to have access to these good resources at the same time, not having to pay so much. But still, with the coming of these new factories into Africa, there's a lot of knowledge and skill transfer. Many of the African countries are beginning to learn from their Indian counterparts how to manufacture these things themselves. So this relationship can only get better and stronger. So I will just go, I'm already at the end. I just have a couple of slides left. So I'll just discuss the econometric results from the analysis. So there were a lot of models that were run. I ran the OLS, the fixed effects. A lot of models were run, but I'm just going to discuss the main one, which is the PPML, and just the main kind of outcomes. I will discuss it briefly and then be done. So the first one is distance. This has a negative coefficient minus 0.59. The implication of this is if you are closer together, or if the African country is close to India, or the distance between them increases by 1%, then the trade will decrease by 0.59%. So these are just pure elasticities. The farther it is, the less trade, and the closer they are together, the more trade. And this is very simple to explain. It's transaction costs. If you're very far away, to get a ship from India to that country will be more expensive. And so there tends to be more trade if the countries are closer together. This result follows closely with the normal gravity model results that we will expect. Also, the GDP of the African country, if the GDP is more, you tend to have more trade. 1% increase in GDP will lead to 0.9% increase in trade. And this is also straightforward, easy to explain. Population also, the larger the population of the country, the more trade you tend to have. Common language dummy is also significant, very significant. If India and the African countries speak a common language, they tend to be more trade between them. So a 1% or a 0. Actually, because the way you interpret these coefficients are a little bit different, simply because we have to take the exponential. So this would result in a 12.7% increase in trade if you are switching languages, or you're now speaking the same language. So language tends to be a pretty important coefficient in terms of determining trade between the two regions. The common colonizer, if you're colonized by also the British, just like India was, this one is not a significant effect, and it's actually moving also in the negative direction, which is a little bit strange. Sub-Saharan Africa the dummy has no effect as well. I wanted to check to see if a country being in Sub-Saharan Africa has either an advantage or disadvantage. The fact that you have a negative coefficient means it's tending towards a disadvantage, but it's also not a significant effect. So we can kind of discount the 10% increase or decrease in trade if you are a sub-Saharan African country. Also, now the institutional variables. Here I have the control of corruption variable, and this one is very significant. And the surprising thing was this variable was significant in all the estimations I did, using all the kind of specifications. It was always negative and always significant. And this basically is saying if you're moving one standard deviation, maybe you're moving from 0 to 1, it will reduce trade by around 21.2%. That's a large, of course, one standard deviation change in the control of corruption variable, as I explained earlier, is a big deal also, but that creates a big impact on trade. And this is counterintuitive because it's actually saying that the more corrupt you are, the more trade you will be able to make with India. The theory tries to explain this using the greasing the wheels idea that if you are in a very low level of development, at least temporarily, corruption seems to be like of benefit to trade, because people who want to import or export things, they might be able to, you know, give some payment to an official, and then he approves the papers very quickly, when normally it would have taken months for you to go through the normal regulatory process. And this was kind of a surprising thing, but at the same time, maybe not also surprising, because from some of the study I did, reading some of the experiences of exporters into Africa, many of them complain that, you know, it's difficult doing business where you don't have a very good regulatory framework, where the courts cannot really help you so much. And so some of these things tends to be a hedge, a kind of hedge against some of the risks that they face if they operate in these economies. The reality is that this particular variable is a very short-term thing. I mean, this impact, if you look at it over the long term, eventually, because you see the other two variables, government effectiveness and regulatory quality, they are both positive and very significant. Meaning, if eventually this corruption begins to influence regulatory quality, then you're going to have a negative effect. Sometimes to delineate the effect of these two things working in opposite directions could be a bit difficult. But the point is, regulatory quality has an overarching positive effect on trade. It will increase trade by 15.4% if your regulatory quality goes up by one standard deviation. Also, if your government effectiveness goes up by one standard deviation, you will increase trade by around 9.7%. And so these effects tends to be, I think, the more long-term view on how you should allow these things to impact. Should it actually impact the economy? Should we be making policy that people should be more corrupt in order to encourage trade? I think this is not the case. I think corruption very often happens as a result of things that happen informally that you cannot really control, where people are trying to, the market is trying to correct itself sometimes. In neoclassical economics, there's the idea that if a market is imbalanced, it tends to try to want to correct itself. Even when a government tries to intervene in the market, you might have the establishment of black markets and other kind of illegal activities trying to create market efficiency. So for very low developed societies, underdeveloped societies, this tends to be a way the market is trying to correct for the inefficiencies by creating more efficiency. And the final slide here is just on the regional differences. I just studied this for interest to see which regions are kind of important in terms of trade. And all the regions have positive effects except the Eastern African bloc. For some reason, East Africa tends to, I think some of the reasons could be, the war and some other things that are going on in those regions, but being in Eastern Africa tends not to be significant to trade. And all the other regions tend to be highly significant. So if you were in North, Central, South, and West Africa, it tends to be of good benefit to trade between these regions. The final one here is if the president or the prime minister of the country, the African country, attended the India-Africa summit. I made a dummy for this, and it was, mildly significant. The last one that happened, there were 34 African countries that attended that summit. Well, the presidents the heads. For some other countries, they sent representatives like the Minister of Finance or Foreign Minister. But for the countries that did attend, that the presidents themselves did attend, those countries tended to have more trade with India, which is a little bit interesting. Although it's not a very large effect, but it's somewhat significant. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Chisom. I think suffice to say that it was a really data enriched and very crucial presentation when it comes to how institutional quality sort of affects the dynamics when it comes to economic partnerships and the overall economic dynamics. With that being said, to further enrich this discussion and gain critical insight on the topic, I would very much like to invite Dr. Abhishek Shul to share his reflections and the criticality on the paper and the topic that has been presented by Dr. Chisom. Professor Abhishek, the floor is with you.
Thank you. It's a wonderful presentation, Chisom. Thank you. First of all, congratulations to the authors for this timely work. The work is not only timely, it addresses a relatively understudied area of India-Africa trade relations. The paper highlights the growing quantum and the potential of India-Africa relations, but it is still has not got the merit that it deserves in economic literature or the trade literature, to be specific. This is also of much more contemporary relevance, particularly given the evolving trade patterns, particularly the geopolitical realignments and the reconfigurations that we are witnessing at the current moment in the world trade. In the economic literature has also taken a shift. Frank Tima's 2024 paper, which has also highlights the potential of global South-South relationships, which can actually be much better for not only for merchandise trade, but also for capital inflows, which would perhaps help us. So this paper would add to that literature. It's also built on a theoretical foundations, rigorous theoretical foundations, the use of the structural gravity model from first principles, and the integration of institutional variables, corruption, regulatory quality, governance will does add further nuance. The PPML model also addresses the common issues in gravity model like zero trade flows, heteroscedasticity, multilateral resistance pointed out by Chisom, Professor Chisom here. The empirical depth is also quite substantial from 96 to 2024, long period, 52 African countries, including institutional variables, again, good. Certain points that I would like to point out here, uh, maybe you can think of Chisom, not much importance either. Anyways, so first point is about the corruption paradox. It's a critical finding is about that the corruption is positively correlated with trade. This is a counterintuitive thing, but you have tried to explain. You use this using the grease the wheels argument, which is common, but certain alternative interpretations could, I think, further enrich the finding. It is an interesting finding. Could it reflect trade in illicit goods, strategic collusions in certain resource sectors, or is it data quality biases in certain fragile states? A little more segregation would perhaps be able to help you to uncover these questions. Second is over reliance on the aggregate trade as one of the variables of this study. The paper treats merchandise trade as an homogeneous block. But India's trade with Africa is, if I may be wrong, Chisom, correct me, maybe it's I believe it's commodity dependent. With crude oil from Nigeria, if you are treating this totally as a homogeneous variable, this would have perhaps lead to certain, it can skew the results. Sectoral decomposition in your robustness studies may add further, like if you are just segregating it into manufacturing, services, or natural resources, broad classifications. More, it would not only help you understand this, move away from aggregate, the over reliance on aggregate trade. Perhaps it would also help you to get more policy relevant insights. You concentrated entirely, even if I am not wrong, on the factors which are entirely on African countries. The domestic factors for India would also play a critical role, because you pointed out in the presentation when you began with the context about the India's certain phases in which the trade patterns between India and Africa evolved, has gone up, it came down. If you could take in certain variables from the India side factors also, then you could perhaps throw also light which side of the domestic variables would perhaps help you to understand that. That which domestic factors are of more importance. A little trying to understand on your econometric methodology, you have focused on the causal inference limitations, right? If I'm not wrong, using the PPML estimator, which is appropriate, but a brief discussion on endogeneity, and I mean to say that reverse causality, that is, whether trade influences institutional quantity, would also, the reverse causality could perhaps bring credibility to your findings. And how would you do that? I would have tried to make a note here. You could use the structural DSG model or the structural VAR model, or the more simplified, the dynamic panel GMM, which accounts for endogeneity. Now, these models came to my mind. You might just think of any other variables. Few suggestions which when I just came to my mind while I was going through your presentation. One, you could include interaction terms like institutional variables and regional dummies. Which regions are like corruption into trade in fragile states versus middle income countries? How is that? Is there anything, certain interaction terms which are worth noting? Non-linearities or thresholds could be one important thing that you could try, probably check. That is, I mean to say, is there a tipping point after which corruption shifts from facilitating to impeding trade actually? Or do a robustness check excluding the oil exporting countries. Then perhaps your results would gain much more significance. Overall, I think it's a wonderful work, a very timely presentation, and great doing. All the best to the authors. Hope to see a great paper coming out in the coming few months. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Abhishek. I think those reflections are quite thoughtful, and yeah, I mean, it not only for Professor Chisom, but it also got me thinking about my understanding of the subject. That being said, that we will now open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. Please feel free to raise your hands or drop your questions in the chat box, and then we can moderate accordingly. Yes, I see one hand raising. I'm sorry, I'm not able to see the name.
I think that is Amlan.
Oh, yes, yes. Thank you.
Hi, Chisom, can you hear me?
Yes.
So, great talk. Thanks. So, just wanted to understand. So, I'm not very familiar with the empirical strategies that you've used, but is it so there seems to be many variables that could be endogenous, right? So, is there a practice of having instruments or something of that sort, especially like, for example, for the corruption variable? So, I think the discussion has also highlighted this. But I was just wondering, is there a tradition of using instruments in these kind of estimations or not?
Amlan, actually, no. Most of the gravity models of trade, they don't use instrumental variables at all. So this is just kind of like a standard run-of-the-mill kind of approach. Maybe I can also show where I showed the model again, if I can find it. Mm,
Yes, Asitha. I'm so sorry for mispronouncing the name.
That's okay. I
okay.
think Chisom is first responding to Omlan, so he can go ahead and then I'll ask.
So it's this one, right? I showed. It kind of has trade on the Y side, and then on the axis you have distance between the countries. You have GDP of India, GDP of the African country, population. Then you have the corruption, governance, and regulatory quality. So normally this is kind of the standard way that it's modeled. Thanks.
Okay, okay. So, but so as I think the discussant has also pointed out. So, is there no discussion about the endogeneity? Because these things, like for example, GDP, right? So, I can understand that there is a structural model from where you are getting this equation.
Which one are you thinking might be endogenous? Are you thinking corruption or?
So, I think many of these variables should be endogenous, right? So for example, trade would affect GDP, right? And vice versa. So, and I don't know if this is lagged or not. Is it lagged?
No,
No,
it's not.
it's not lagged, right? So then, so for example, corruption could also be, we could think about channels through which corruption might be affecting trade and vice versa,
Hmm.
right? So all of these, especially GDP, right? GDP is something that would be
Yeah, I didn't explain in this particular talk because it was meant to be like kind of the non-technical thing. But in the paper, there's a huge section on this specific way we arrive at this model. So it's not really just come up, it's not just been cobbled together. Like there's a lot of background behind how the model works. But in most papers, that's just the standard thing. I mean, the idea is following from Newton's law of gravity that like trade is kind of like the gravitational
right.
attraction. But then you have the distance and the size components as well. But I mean, it's pretty standard.
Okay, I understand. Okay, fine. Fine. Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Uh, Hi, Chizom. Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. I learned a lot. And in fact, I learned a lot from Abhishek's comments as well. One of my question is related to what Abhishek and Amlan both are asking, that there is, I mean, yes, this might be a standard model. I hope I'm audible. Uh, am I audible?
Yes.
Ah, okay.
Yes, yes.
So this might be a standard model, the gravitation model, but we cannot really like GDP and trade are interlinked. Population and trade will be interlinked. Most of these variables will be interlinked, and what is the way out of that? So I think Omlan has already pointed that out. So maybe a way to think forward. Second, because what I understood from the presentation, and correct me if I'm wrong, what I understood from the presentation is that you wanted to use the gravity model because you want to see that how distance has an impact on the trade. My bigger question to that would be that that means which are the African nations, which are showing, according to you, North Africa is showing maximum trade, etc. But is that also because of the commodity that they have, and not only the distance part of it, and not only the transaction cost of it? It might be the commodity that might be influencing that trade. So, is that something that has been like? Is it necessary that distance will be the only reason why there will be more trade with that region?
Yeah, thanks for that, Ashita. I think in this kinds of models, the individual independent variables are supposed to be independent, right? So you're looking at the ceteris paribus kind of thing. You're looking at trade as if nothing else existed, and the effect of that distance on trade. But I get the point on sectoral or differences, which Abhishek also raised, and I think it might be worth to look into this to kind of disaggregate the kinds of goods or sectors, manufacturing sector, natural resource sector, and just see if that has any impact on the result. But I take your point. That's very, very helpful. Thank you so much, Ashita.
Professor Chisom, if while waiting for the other questions, do you mind if I ask a question?
I think someone else had raised their hand. I don't know.
It was yeah. I'm just trying to see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead. Yes.
Yes, and for others, if you have these questions, please raise your hand. We'll trace it to that. Thank you very much for the presentation, Professor. I just had a bit of a technicality back. The efficient corruption thesis that you had highlighted, is more from a very knowledge point of view for me because I've not come across. But uh, does that, like, let's say, argument position gives any data that with this thesis sort of has been proved or somewhat have been relatively been tried? I mean, are there any examples that, let's say, we can correlate to? I mean, just as a knowledge question in general.
Yes, yes, yes. I showed a couple of them, some papers that had done this. I'll just go back there. So, like, just a minute, please. Yeah. So, like this Ashimoglu and Redie paper, Huntington, there are a lot more recent ones as well. I haven't put here in the paper itself. I have some more examples. There are a lot, but the thing is, all these things are very country and situation specific. As I said earlier, they are mostly in developing countries. People have done studies on very situations where the institutions themselves are not working, and the market is trying to correct it, it's trying to correct the problem. For developed countries, the sanding the wheels hypothesis tends to be the most predominant idea. But there are many examples using real data that have shown how corruption could actually kind of facilitate things to move forward a little bit. So I could send you, later some of the papers themselves. Thanks. I think
Thank you.
Devika is raising her hand.
Yes, I was just saying that. Professor Devika, am I audible? Wait, she's not in the chat. Wait a second. Yeah, she's not currently in the call right now. I'm not able to see her.
She put a question on the chat, I think.
Yes. Yeah, do you mind? I shall read it out if it's fine.
Sure.
Yeah. So, yeah. So basically, she starts writing like, for example, congratulations, Professor Chisholm, on such an interesting presentation. Basically, she's asking her question from a foreign policy perspective. And she said that she basically studies and researches on Latin America, and we keep trying to see how government will, especially on the Indian side, increases or decreases. I think in that context, maybe she's answering on a much more foreign policy perspective. I'm trying to give her the access so she can ask the question herself. Just give me a second. Oh yeah, Professor Devika, can you unmute yourself now?
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yeah, now you are. Yes, yes, yes.
Oh my God. Okay, so I think we are in that large admissions webinar format because it wasn't even giving me access to the chat. I had to use the Q&A.
Right,
So yeah,
right.
so I mean, again, Chisom, congratulations on such an interesting paper. It seems to be fairly, I think, almost ready for publication. So congratulations on that as well. And again, I know nothing about international development. I am not even close to anything economic related. But this question that I have is that when we kind of try and see Indian trade engagement, especially with these large regions in the global south, whether it's Latin America, whether it's Africa, and we keep trying to see, okay, what is the government will? Like, how does India's priority to these trade sectors within these global south large mega regions, how does that kind of increase or decrease the trade volume, as it were? And the one thing that we would always say about those of us who are studying Latin America, we'll say that there is no real political will. It's rather run by small businesses. So what is there a link there? I mean, again, this might be completely outside the purview of your paper, but I was curious. Do you think that there is a link there, like the fact that India does want to hopefully establish a presence in the region, be more of a partner? Is there something that we are doing on the foreign policy side which is aiding or supporting this trade process? Again, I just wanted you to have a question from me as well because I listened to the paper, but feel free to ignore it if it's not relevant.
Yeah, thank you, Devika. That's very relevant, very interesting. Yeah, of course. I mean, India has been making a lot of efforts. I mentioned earlier in the talk on, during India's G20 presidency, how they pushed so hard for the AU, the African Union, to become a part of that body. A lot of other diplomatic efforts going on. I think the underlying kind of thinking or current is this competition with China, which of course is there. I mean, we can't ignore that thing is there. And of course, China's influence on Africa is growing by the day. Current total trade between China and Africa reaching almost $300 billion, almost 3 times or even 4 times the trade between India and Africa. So I think there's a lot of kind of, on the diplomatic side also, it makes a lot of sense for India to try to spread its tentacles. India likes to position itself as the leader of the global south. And in many ways, I think, this trade, question is a big deal. So yeah, I think there's a very huge diplomatic question there. Actually, I put that variable there on what African presidents attended the India-African Summit as a explanatory variable of trade. And I was surprised to see that that was actually that was significant in some way. So yeah, I think definitely you're onto something there, Devika.
That's fascinating. I look forward to reading your paper. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yes, Professor Abhishek, your hand is up. Yeah.
When you're talking about India's growing presence, I had a basic, trying to understand the nature of trade. Is the nature of trade between India and Africa, and that exists between China and Africa, is the pattern same or is it entirely different? Because you also talked about a large part of India's exports to Africa are manufactured goods. How are the Chinese placed then? Because China is supposed to be one of the factory shows of the world, producing almost everything there.
Yeah, it's very similar. Actually, the trade balance between China and Africa is in favor of China. Remember, I showed the picture of the trade balance between India and Africa, where the favor was in Africa, mostly based on natural resources like oil, minerals, etc. But on the China side, China is actually exporting more to Africa in terms of finished goods than they are importing from Africa. So they are, yeah, the factory of the world, as it were.
Put a paper in the chat if you may like to look into it. It looks into these institutional factors and this takes care of the panel, dynamic panel, this paper that I saw while I was trying to read your paper. I don't know whether it will be useful or not, but I came across it, so I just thought it would be better pointing it out to you. Thank you. All the best.
Right. For anyone else willing to ask a question, you can please raise your hand or type it on the Q&A chat box. We can take one more, I guess. Actually, have time.
If there's no one else, I'll
Right.
just, if it's okay with everyone else. So just going back to Abhishek's point, if the trade balance is in favor of China and it's not in favor of India as vis-a-vis Africa, this is an important question. So, I mean, this is something to be thought about when India is like, I'm also now thinking in terms of international relations and international politics that India trying to, and as Chisom said, that basically trying to become this a power of the South, etc. Will it actually be able to like? And I'm basically thinking of this question loud and also posing it to Chisom. So yeah.
Yeah, Abhishek, what do you think?
Long time to go.
Well, I think it's possible. I mean, from the trajectory is moving in the right direction, but I think it's going to take a tremendous amount of still effort to be able to get that. Yeah.
Sorry, please.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Why? I was thinking in 2 points. One is if we're talking about manufactured exports, India's manufacturing means just presence, domestic presence, manufacturing is way behind compared to China or even compared to many other emerging market economies. We have leapfrogged the manufacturing sector. In terms of, if you look at services also, we are at one part where we are trying to specialize, even in the top end. If you look at the smile curve of the trade, this trade services of trade also, we are not at the top end of the services by exports as well. So to get a global presence, to be the leader of the global South, India will have to rethink its, reconfigure the trade patterns. My view, I may be wrong.
This actually, this makes me sorry, like it's three of us having a conversation, but this actually makes me think for Africa as well. So when Chisom, you were presenting and you were saying that basically the commodities that we import from India, one of them is pharmaceutical, etc. Actually, if you think about it, India also is dependent upon China for imports of raw materials of pharmaceuticals. So, this may, and at that very moment, I was thinking that when you say, okay, a lot of like policymakers say that Africa should become self-dependent and start creating its own commodities, might not be a bad idea because that's where I feel India is failing and has failed. That is why I think Abhishek's response was, "It's not going to happen." Yeah.
If I may just jump in,
Yeah.
given this can of worms has been opened. So I think there is a lot to be learned in, like, especially from the Indian perspective, this entire, as far as IR and foreign policy posturing is concerned. When we study this global South trade strategy, and especially like India pitting itself or at least positioning itself as a valid trade competitor to China, like, you are absolutely right that not only are we very far off, I don't think that we can actually compete with China, whether it's in terms of just providing the kind of investments that both these big regions in the South would want, the kind of presence that China has been able to maintain. For example, just to give you a sense from what's happening in the Latin American region, which has a lower trade priority or lower priority for cooperation than Africa as a mega region does for India. One of the things that the Latin Americanists will always say to me whenever we're on these panels, they'll say that, okay, think about it, like maybe 10-15 years ago, China was nowhere in Latin America, right? But they invested so heavily in developing themselves as not only as big trade partners, as a country which had a lot of money to give like long-term, very low interest loans in both these regions which are specializing in commodity trade. It's also the kind of work that China has done. Like, look at the amount of centers for, just learning about China that they have built around Latin America. Today, if you go into any big university in Latin America, they might not have an Asia or even Eurasia center because they still use that term there. But they'll have a China studies center. They'll have people who are actively researching on Latin America and China trade, people who are writing papers on this. So then they'll counter this and they'll say, where has India been? So even I think some of these comparisons are just ludicrous if you look at the trade volumes. So the only saving grace which I have seen in the papers that come out from the Indian side is that, okay, look, the growth has been tremendous. Where we used to do like maybe 0.001% trade, now we are doing 1% trade. So the growth is there, the trajectory is on the right path. Also, the second point about the commodity trade, I think there are great, again, I will let Chisom expand on this more because I'm not an economist, but there are such deep patterns of colonial development that were instituted in both of these regions, right? It's when we say that, okay, don't maybe reduce your dependence on the world, there is a lot that both these regions would need in terms of just developing their infrastructure, the kind of loans that they need, the kind of investment and time that they need to like shift from this resource oriented trade pattern. So we have to be cautious when we give these suggestions as well about whether it's Africa as a mega region or even Latin America, that, okay, they need to diversify what they are trading in. They need time. And as far as India is concerned, the big thing that India will always posit itself as is that, okay, we are the better partner. We are not the exploitative partner. So I have seen that a lot of very small sub-regions, small countries, that this relationship with African Union that Chisom has already mentioned, there is a lot of active agency that is going on in all of these countries where they are trying to diversify at least their trade partnership, if not their trade product structure. So they are very aware that China is exploitative, that a deal with China can mean bad things, but it also means that they have access to certain resources to take on that path of diversification. So yeah, it's very interesting, and I would think that Chisom, now that you've started this journey with Africa, it would be very interesting to see more comparisons on like where would India actually stand in some of these calculations. How much of it is just bravado that's coming from our ministry and our our side of policy making, and what could India concretely do to actually emerge as a powerhouse in the African region. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Devika. That's very insightful. I'm definitely going to work more on this, these ideas, because there's a lot here. There's a lot that can be still studied on this, Yeah, thanks.
And also the lessons which Africa should take from India on what not to do. And yeah, and probably become more self-reliant. Look east and look at how they've managed it. So yeah, I guess a very interesting paper, Chisom. Like certain technical things, I think Abhishek will be taking that on and discussing. But yeah.
I think that discussion was as enriching as it could have been. Like, do we have any other questions? We can, if not, then we can see ahead. Right. I think there are no questions on the chat box, so I think so. Yeah, answered.